men were laboring in a courtyard in Italy. One man's face was downcast, shoulders slooped, muscles strained, and a priest came walking through the courtyard. And he said, "What are you doing, my son?" He said, "I'm chipping stone." The priest walked over to the other man. His shoulders too were slumped, muscles strained, but he had a slight smile on his face. And he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm building a cathedral." Two men doing exactly the same thing. One was chipping stone, the other was building a cathedral. The only difference was vision. So who would you identify more with? The stone chipper who's just kind of focused on his day, his week, his month, hopefully picking up a paycheck here and there? Or would you identify more with the cathedral builder who has dreams, has visions, has goals, knows where he's going, who he wants to take with him? If you identified more with a stone chipper, what would it take for you to go from being a stone chipper to a cathedral builder? And if you identified more with a cathedral builder, what would it take to go from being a cathedral builder to the next level? It all has to do with your story. Our story is who we are. Our vision is what we do with who we are. Now, here's the best part about story. If you don't like where you're at, you can always change it. So what's your story? Well, let me share a little bit about my story. It was September 1966. I grew up in a little house in the Canadian prairies. Life was simple but good. And then one day, in just one day, my whole life turned around. My precious 2-year-old brother was crushed in a tractor accident. My dad sped 90 miles an hour on the gravel road to the nearest hospital. I sat in the back seat of the car, and I cradled little Billy in my arms, and he said, "Owie, Nina." Those were his final words. That moment changed my life forever. There are about 200,000 reported accidents in the U.S. alone every year. It can only be estimated, but there are about 1 million people each year who feel responsible for those accidents. My story falls in the latter category. You see, I was the one driving the tractor. So what do you do when you have reached your darkest moment? How do you go from your darkest moment to living the life you were meant to live? How do you keep from being stuck in your story when your whole world has just come crashing in? The very next morning, my big, strong dad came to my bedroom door and he said, "You've got to get up. We have to keep going." Getting out of bed that day was the toughest thing I did. That day, the next, for weeks and months and years to come. You see, getting out of bed meant having those courageous conversations. I would get to the breakfast table and the only word spoken was, "Pass me the jam." I didn't know how I would face the people in our small community of 500 when word spread so quickly. And worse yet, how would I ever step back into high school? It was my first month of high school, and I was terrified that someone would ask me, "Why did you miss a week of school?" But the most courageous conversation took place 15 years later in my therapist's office. She was quick to identify the guilt that I had buried so deep. And then one day, she walked me through in slow motion that horrible, horrible day. I sobbed from such depth, I didn't know if I'd ever recover. And when the session was over, she said, "I don't want you to drive home like this. I have a separate waiting room. I'd like you to wait there until you're ready to drive home." As I went there and finally calmed down, I heard a still small voice in my head, and the conversation went something like this. "Has God forgiven you?" I said, "Yes." "Have your parents forgiven you?" I believe they have. Then what keeps you from forgiving yourself? I didn't have an answer. That led to the most courageous conversation I had. It was a conversation with myself. And when I finally mustered enough courage to forgive myself, there was such a huge emotional load that lifted. I didn't drive home that day. I flew home. It was a long journey to healing. But in the process, I discovered every time an emotional storm would come up, I needed to do 3 things. One is I had to identify the storm. I'm talking about things like the guilt, the shame, the fear, the anger, the loneliness, the sadness. There's an important principle that says you cannot confront what you do not identify. The first thing I had to do was name the negative emotion. Secondly, I needed to make a decision. I needed to make a choice. Would I push away, hide from, run from, or would I face that negative emotion? Just over the hill from where we live, there are some beautiful ranches. There's a cattle ranch, horse ranches, even a buffalo ranch. Well, growing up in the farm, I learned very quickly that cattle are not known for their speed. In fact, if any of you have been around cows, you know they're very slow runners. Well, cows will sense a storm coming. So let's say a storm is coming from this direction, headed this way. Cows will turn and run the same direction the storm is headed, therefore prolong the storm. Buffalo, on the other hand, they too will sense a storm coming, and they will turn, face the storm, and get through it much more quickly. So every time I was faced with an emotional storm, I had to make a decision. Would I find a way to avoid it and therefore prolong it, or would I face it? And even if I faced the storm, that didn't mean it happened. That takes us to step number 3, take action. So 1, name the negative emotion. 2, make a choice. Avoid it or face it, and 3, take action. It was a long journey to healing, but as I came to complete healing and finally owned my story, something shifted in here. It was like I felt like I had discovered the power of story and uncovered gold. Through the lengthy, costly journey to healing, I realized that there was something that was much more costly than that journey to healing, and that would be the price of staying stuck in my story. You see, that would be the price of relationships, the price of lack of fulfillment, the price of denying the greatest gift I had been given, my story. And if I denied that gift, I would never have the opportunity or the potential to reach the people I was called to reach. I also discovered in the process that story is the number one way to connect with people, the people we want to reach. It is the number one way to impact people, and most of all, it has the power to transform lives. I began asking a number of questions, and I thought, wait a minute, if story is that important, why are we not telling our stories every day? After doing some research, I discovered the number one reason is because most people don't even believe they have a story. Well, let me just tell you, nothing could be farther from the truth. In the last 40 years, I've helped thousands of people with their story, and I've yet to find one person who does not have a story. Everyone has a story, and people are waiting to hear your story. Something else shifted for me when I finally owned my story, and that was my mission. Rather than helping thousands of people, my mission changed. to helping millions. My mission is to help you find, create, tell your story, find the wealth in your story, and show you how you can impact millions of people. I hope if there's nothing else you go home with today, that you will know and remember that your story matters. You have an important story, and others are waiting to hear it. The key to going from being a stone chipper to a cathedral builder is through courageous conversation. The key to going from facing your darkest moment to living the life you were meant to live is through courageous conversation. The key to going from being stuck in your story to unstoppable is through courageous conversation. Brené Brown says, owning our story and loving ourselves in the process is the bravest thing we will ever do. It certainly was for me. Thank you.